Hello, so this is going to be my intro to items guide for beginners. I'm basically going to be talking about components, what items you can make, different utility items, stuff like that to kind of get started in dealing with items in set 13 of TFT. This is going to be part one of a multi-part series. Later, we're going to talk about specific items for specific units, as well as diminishing returns. That will probably be a tomorrow's video, ideally if I can finish it in time. But for right now, for part one, this is going to be an intro to items. If you're asking yourself, who is this guy? Basically, I have this channel that has now become my main channel, which is just me doing TFT guides as well as TFT VOD reviews to try and help people to learn the game of TFT if they so choose to consume that content from me. If you like my content, if you watched a couple of my videos in the past, or even if you're new here, please make sure to like and subscribe because it helps me out a lot. Our giveaway is also ending very soon, so if you see this video tonight, as soon as it's posted, please make sure to join the Discord and enter in the giveaway channel as I instructed in some of the previous videos this week. Anyways, the way I'm going to start this guide is with a little fun question that you can kind of think about yourself and keep in the back of your mind throughout this presentation, which is, should I make Adaptive Helm? Now, Adaptive Helm, love it or hate it, some people really love it, some people really hate it. It's a very flexible item. It has effects that you can use it both as a frontline item, you can use it both as a backline item. Some people think that it's a little bit underpowered, some people think it's overpowered, but undeniably, if you look at the stats, it is one of the best performing items in the current patch of TFT. Does that mean you should just instantly make Adaptive Helm if you have the opportunity to? Well, a lot of that depends on your current situation in the game, so we're going to actually come back to this question, and hopefully we can answer it by the end of this presentation. Hopefully you'll gain the skill set so that you can answer that for yourself as well as I go through explaining items the best that I can. So, first of all, because this is going to be the part one of a series, I'm just going to do a quick little intro of how you get items. This is like, for the very beginners of TFT, but basically you get components. These are usually components or item drops. You get them from different orbs, or you get them from neutral rounds where you're fighting either Krugs, Raptors, Wolves, or the Dragons. If you have two components, then you can make an item out of those components. Additionally, there are carousel rounds at the midpoint of every stage. You can pick up an item on the carousel, or sorry, a component or an item on the carousel, as well as sometimes you can get drop spatulas and emblems. We're not going to focus on those. We're mostly just going to focus on craftable items in this presentation. Additionally, you can also get items from augments. Sometimes you'll either get a complete item and it'll usually power up that item or give you some bonus effects, something like an augment like Crown Guarded, or Big Grab Bag. And a lot of times these are often avoided. I remember when I was a beginner at TFT, I usually avoided these item augments a lot of the time because I just didn't understand. It's like, okay, why do I need more components? Why do I need more items? Eventually, through the course of this multi-part series, you'll start to notice that some of these are just like really good defaults, right? If you're just looking for an augment that just boosts your power level a little bit and nothing that's like really forcing something generic to take, a lot of times these item and component augments are very reliable of just giving you some sort of base power because of how powerful items are depending on how you use them on which units. So, how do item drops work? So now this is the part where I'm going to try something new in the videos. I'm going to try and like draw it out and do it like kind of lecture style, like how I used to do when I was a TA. But anyways, when you're dealing with items, right? There is a coding system in TFT. The design of it is like these bags or item bags, right? So what happens is for every person in the game of TFT, every time you queue into TFT, you basically have a bag at the start of the game. And this bag is like a coding term or whatever term, probability term. In this bag, there are going to be 2 copies of each component that you could get dropped. So I'm going to color code them. I'm just going to put them in. So pretend that each color is a different component that you can get in TFT. In TFT, there are 8 components. So originally your bag starts out with 16 total items, or sorry, 16 total components inside the bag. So here I'm just going to draw a couple, and I'm going to put like a ... and ellipses, because I think that's like set notation. But anyways, basically this bag has 16 components inside of it. So when you get a drop in TFT, so starting the game or on Krugs or on neutral rounds, what's going to happen is it's going to look inside this bag. And of these 16 total items, it will then give you however many components you're supposed to get. So let's say after the first round, you get 1 component, right? Let's say it's going to be a tier, right? Because a tier is a very easy component for me to draw. What's going to happen is you're going to get this 1 tier. There's going to be 2 tiers inside of here, by the way. You're going to get 1 tier, and then it's going to get removed from the bag. Once it's removed from the bag, you are now less likely to see a tier because of the original 16 components, there are now going to be 15 components inside the bag, of which only one of them was a tier, and originally there were 2 tiers inside of the bag. So this is what happens at the game start. So this is start. Every carousel round, your bag gets refilled with some extra components. So the way it works is on Carousel. I don't know how to spell Carousel. Don't worry. I don't care. I won't read the comments that tell me I spelled it wrong. On your Carousel round, what's going to happen is you are then going to get dropped. You're going to have your same bag, right? Whatever your bag originally was. I should just make this like bigger. Give me 1 second. I'll do it properly. Here we go. So in your bag, so remember before we had this, we had this, we had this, and we had this, and we have this, right? So originally there was like 15 total items. Obviously there's like a dot here. Let me just draw for the sake of example, right? And then we have like the rest of them that I'm just too lazy to draw all of them, right? But there would be 15 inside of here. What happens is on a carousel round, in the background, you don't see this obviously because this is just how it's like works in the background of the game. You are going to get one of each component is going to get added back into the bag, right? So basically what's going to happen is you are now going to get one extra version of each of these items in this bag. So instead of it being here, in the case of this example, right, you're going to get one more of this, 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 and then it's basically because there's 8 components in the game, you're gonna get a plus 8 components here, which is then gonna turn this into a bag that has, instead of 15, it's gonna be plus 8, so it's gonna be 23 components in the bag, right? Then we can go back here, right, and then you will have, like, let's say this is like stage 2, you'll have your neutral round, which will be Krugs. You will then get drops from this bag on Krugs. So as you can see, let's say you wanted a tier, right? Originally your odds of getting a tier, so then I'll say like tier odds. I'm just using tier because tier was the blue example that we have over here. Your tier odds originally start out as 1 out of 8. Then eventually it drops down to 2 out of 23 because there's only 2 left. So as you can see, it's not like it's not always like a 1 out of 8 chance each time that you see the items, right? It's gonna slowly decrease the odds based on what components that you get, right? If you get dropped a tier on your early stage, you are now less likely to see tier, and that's how the system kind of works. So this bag gets an extra component each time you go around Carousel. That's why sometimes you'll hear me or other people say, hey, that's really high roll that I got 2 tiers off the round star, or that's really unlikely that I got 3 of the same components, right? If you get 3 of the same components, not taking into account what you take at different augments or Carousel rounds, you're basically like beating the odds a lot of the time. Whenever you see a component, you should always expect that that might be the only time you see that particular component. Now, another thing that's really important to note is that Carousel and augments don't count, right? So this bag is unaffected by Carousel and augments. So let's say you see a tier and then you go on Carousel and you take another tier. That's not going to change the odds of you seeing a tier before. The only thing that's going to happen is whatever your bag is, the items that you get dropped are respective of that bag. Anyways, that's the long-winded explanation of it. I don't know if this is explained a lot, but this is just, it becomes common knowledge if you played a bunch of TFT, because eventually you look it up at one point, you hear people talk about it. But hopefully if I was introducing it to you, it makes sense, and hopefully the picture helped a little bit. But anyways, let's get back to our presentation now and continue with items. That's just to give you a rough idea, because then a lot of the stuff that I explain, you kind of have an understanding of how the probability gets affected in those ways. Anyways, so when you're thinking about what to take on Carousel, a lot of times you can govern it by 3 different rules. You can either go on Carousel to complete the items that you already have, and that's usually very, very strong if you're playing tempo, which means you're just playing really aggressively and you're trying to win streak. You can take components that you already got because you're less likely to see them through later drops, as we just explained, because of the system that's in place in TFT. Or you can also take priority items that are basically important components that you think are going to be very, very strong for your team comp later, which we'll talk about a little bit, probably in part 2 and part 3 of these type of videos. Now, the rest of this presentation is going to be talking about different examples that will hopefully bring all of the stuff that I explained to you to light, to give you an idea of what you can do from your early to mid game to late game. So let's do an example with Heimerdinger. I really like using the example of Heimerdinger because AP to me comes very naturally. I'm usually like an AP flex player. I have an AP flex guide on my channel that you can also check out, which I talk about some of the concepts in this video as well. So with Heimerdinger, right now in the current patch, if you're trying to think of what the quote-unquote best items for Heimer are, a lot of times the one that's thrown around is blue buff, Nashers, and Archangels. So blue buff requires you to use 2 tiers. Nasher's Tooth is a bow and a belt, and Archangels is a tier and a rod. And the idea is that blue buff is really strong on Heimer because he has a very low mana threshold. Nasher's Tooth gives him a bunch of attack speed, so the two first items help him to cast a bunch. And then Archangels scales really effectively because Heimer also scales with casting, and he makes a bunch of rockets. So then if Archangels gives him a bunch of AP, he does a bunch of damage. The problem with this is that if you look at it, to make these 3 items, you basically need 3 tiers, a belt, a rod, and a bow. Now, if you're looking at these items, remember what we were talking about. If you get dropped 1 tier, it's very unlikely that you're going to get dropped, it's less likely, excuse me, that you're going to get dropped another tier. And for you to get dropped 3 tiers, it's going to be very unlikely because every single carousel, your bag is going to get 8 additional components, so it's going to be less and less likely for you to see this many tiers. Now, obviously, this might not be the perfect Heimer items. I'm sure there's some niche situations where other items are better. I'm just using this for sake of example because this is a very commonly discussed, like, these are quote-unquote the best items that you can make. So specifically, you can also consider which items are good on other units. If you're making blue buff, not only is it really unlikely that you'll be able to make blue buff is also not very flexible. It's only good on Heimerdinger if you're considering 4 cost. There's some other units in some niche lines that it's pretty good on, but typically if you see blue buff, it means that you kind of have to play Heimer. So unless you're forcing yourself that it's like your spot is really good, like you're playing around Sentinels, you have a Sentinel augment, or you have a spatula for Sentinels or a spatula for Academy, for example, blue buff isn't that good because, for example, if you want to then pivot or change to a different AP line based on your items or your other drops, blue buff won't be very good on somebody like Silco who really wants a Shojin. Now Shojin, the item that's underneath Silco, only needs 1 tier. It takes 1 tier and 1 sword, which we'll talk about later, and it's actually okay on both Heimer and Silco. Basically, blue buff only works on Heimer, Shojin can work on Heimer or Silco, so you have a lot more flexibility with that option. Now, we're going to talk way more about this in tomorrow's video, because tomorrow's video we're going to talk about diminishing returns, carry itemizations, as well as carry stacking, which are different concepts relating to putting items on specific units. We're not going to get too much into that because I'm mostly just introducing items and item economy and just giving you like a general framework, and then part 2 will go more in depth on which items are good on which units and why. So, in terms of items, there's something that you'll usually hear as item economy, as well as the term killing components. Item economy, the idea is that you want to use components in a way that sets you up for later usable items. You don't want to slam items that kind of run you into a hole that then you have a bunch of components that don't do anything later in the game. An example is this. We're going to keep going with this AP line because it's just a little bit more intuitive and easy to explain. But let's say you have tier, bow, belt, sword. These are the components that you have. If you think about different options of items that you can make, if you're trying to play around an AP 4 cost, for example, you can go with option 1 or option 2. Option 1, you can make blue buff, you can make Nashers, and then you can play around a sword. The sword is going to be your leftover component because blue buff requires the 2 tiers and Nashers requires the bow and the belt. Now, you also have a second option, which is option 2. You can make a Shojin and a Nashers, by which you're using the sword and 1 tier, and then what you will be left over with, is a tier. So you have to decide. With option 1, you get blue buff Nashers. You're basically very forced to play around Heimerdinger, and you have a sword that you have to then use. Option 2, you make Shojin Nashers. You have a lot more flexibility, and then a tier, which is a lot more of a higher value component. Tier is very useful for both frontline items as well as backline items. You can then use that tier to make another item. Specifically, even with Heimerdinger, it's really important to hold on to a tier, because if you kill the items, you might not be able to make Archangels. If you look at this itemization that only requires 2 tiers, you can make a Shojin, a Nashers, and Archangels. Now, Shojin Nashers is going to be a little bit worse than blue buff Nashers, but you still get the value of using that tier on the Archangels, which is something that's very important to Heimerdinger. If you look at the side, this itemization only uses 2 tiers instead of having to require 3 tiers, and it also quote-unquote kills a sword. A sword which isn't that good for frontline items and isn't that good for backline items if you're playing AP specifically. it's going to be hard to deal with, right? If you're using a sword, there's very few items you can make. You can make a guard breaker, which you can make a giant slayer, which if you look at the stats on, or the information about giant slayer, it doesn't get a lot of value early game. It's mostly a late game item because you need to have a certain amount of HP on the opponent's board in order for it to actually do anything in the first place. So that's not that great a lot of the time. Gunblade doesn't give a lot of damage. It's more just for healing and utility. So then what's left, right? The frontline items there's not that many. Like Sterix is usually like a more of a melee focused thing. Bloodthirster is more of a melee focused thing. So it's very hard to figure out what to make in these comps. Now, obviously you can just itemize a secondary carry, but a lot of times for item economy, it makes sense to kill the sword with a tier, make Shojin, even though it's a little bit less optimal. You then get another tier that you can play around. You're less likely to see a tier, but you're more likely to see a rod, and then you can make your archangels, and you'll have your items that way. So, in terms of killing off items, you also want to make sure that you're not killing off items that could have late game usage, right? Tier, even if it doesn't become a Heimer item, there's lots of really good frontline items. Redemption, Protector's Vow, Adaptive Helm. These are all things you can put on your frontline units. Additionally, you can also make Shred, because you can make a static shift. So if you don't have an option for Shred, you can boost your damage significantly by reducing a magic resist using the tier. This brings me to utility items, right? A lot of times when you're killing components, you want to make sure that you're not killing components that you would later need for utility items. Utility items are ones that give you team-wide buffs that can kind of help out for your overall damage, or basically like act as a way of reducing the amount of healing that your opponent has. So for example, anti-heal. Anti-heal, what it does, it makes it so that the opponent's units don't heal as much, and it's very, very important, especially if they have like some sort of drain tank, or they have something that heals a bunch back to full. It helps a lot in actually getting rid of a tank. So when you have anti-heal, it can really sway a fight in a late game scenario. So I can't stress how important it is to make. Sometimes it doesn't matter if the opponent has no healing, but it's usually generally very, very good to make anti-heal items. And you can make that using 2 bows. You can make it as a Morello using a rod and a belt, or you can use it making a Sunfire Cape, which is a belt and a chainmail. A lot of times in the current meta, the most common one to make is Sunfire Cape, because it's a pretty good tank item, and it also gives anti-heal. Additionally, you can make Sundering, which is armor reduction if you're playing AD, or Shred, which is max resist reduction if you're playing AP. So when you look at these components, you'll see a lot of common things across the board. There's a lot of bows across all of these items. There's a lot of belts across all of these items, and there's a lot of cloaks off of these items. These are high value components that, you know, if you're going to use a belt or a bow, or if you're going to use certain components, you want to make sure that you still leave the option open to eventually make anti-heal, Sunder, or Shred, because overall that will put you in a much better spot in your games than just like trying to follow a guide and put like whatever the quote-unquote best in slot items are for the units. Utility items, often in my games, I try to prioritize them if the spot prevails me to, just because you can't go wrong, right? If you know that you're playing AP or AD, making Shred and Sunder, you can't really go wrong with it. And then making anti-heal is always typically very good. The only thing I would say is with some components, for example, with bows, gloves, and tiers and rods, you might if you're too trigger happy and you make Shred early with like a bow and a tier, then you might not be able to make mana generation items because you might not get dropped another tier. But the idea is that you want to try and balance the use of your components in order to be able to also make some of these high value items that are just basically like buffs that buff your whole damage or reduce the opponent's healing, so that it makes it so it's easier to take down big tanks. Now, as another example, we're just going to talk about carousel picks, right? So what do you take on carousel here? If you look on the left of the screen, we're going to say these are your items, right? You have tier, bow, and belt. And on carousel, you have sword, tier, and rod. Option 1, right? If you're on carousel and you're trying to pick, you can take the sword, right? Now, taking a sword is really good if you're playing tempo, because with a sword, you can complete the item set of Shojin with Nashers. Shojin Nashers is a really good pairing, because Nashers gives you a bunch of attack speed when you cast, and Shojin gives you extra mana every time you attack. So with Shojin Nashers together, you basically generate a bunch of mana, you cast, then you get Nashers, which gives you a bunch of attack speed, which in turn makes you attack more, which in turn makes you get more mana, which then makes you cast again, which then gives you attack speed, which then gives it just makes you cast a bunch. So if you have a unit that really wants to cast, it's a really good item pairing, and that's why it works out that way. If you're trying to complete Shojin Nashers, you could just take the sword, and then that guarantees you have Shojin Nashers, and it makes your board a lot stronger because it gives you that synergy. However, if you're taking a sword on carousel, you didn't get dropped a sword, and you're playing AP, now you might be stuck with an extra sword. You're more likely to see a sword than you are to see a tier, for example. So maybe on Carousel, if you're not trying to win streak, you might not want to take a sword because you'll have to deal with, if you get dropped another sword later in the game, or even two, and you're unlucky, you might have a hard time dealing with that depending on what you're playing. Option 2 is that you might take a tier. You already got dropped a tier, so you're less likely to see a tier again if you get like on your Krugs or your later drops. So if you see a tier on Carousel, you can prioritize taking the tier. Now the tier is really good for Archangels or blue buff, so really you're not going to slam an item right away because you don't want to necessarily kill both your tiers because they're very useful, but you can make Nashers and then sit being kind of happy that you can play around 2 tiers in order to make both frontline or backline items, because it's a very, very good item in the line that you're playing if you're playing AP. Additionally, AP is all around ability power, and Rod gives you AP. It can make a lot of good AP items. Pretty much every item that you can make with Rod will give you AP. So if you are playing AP, right now we're talking about mana generation and casting. Option 3 is that you can just take the Rod for flexibility. You don't have to necessarily decide if you're making blue buff Shojin. You don't have to necessarily decide that you're going to like play around tier for Archangels or a frontline item. You can take a Rod because Rod can make a lot of the utility items as well. You can make a Morello or anti-heal. You can make a Spark for Shred. You can make a Gwinsu if you're playing a different line and you want to pivot because you get dropped a bunch of swords and then you want to play AD. So if you want to play if you want to be flexible, you can just take another option, which then gives you the opportunity to make other items. These options 2 and option 3 are more for if you're not necessarily win streaking and you're not playing tempo, because then you can delay making your items and try and greed your components in order to make them a little bit later in the game. Finally, we're going to go through a couple last examples and then we're going to be done for today. But basically, I'm going to show you some components and I'm going to ask the question what to slam, and then I'm going to explain my thought process when I see these types of components, and then you can maybe apply a similar skill set over the course of watching this video that you hopefully have learned. So what to slam. If you have a Rod and a Cloak and you have a Bow and a Bow, what are items that you can possibly make? If you look at these items, let's say you're playing around AD, right? You're playing snipers, right? You want to play Twitch carry, you want to play Maddie carry, you want to play Zeri carry, you want to play Kog'Maw carry, for example. You might want to just slam Gwinsu. Gwinsu is really, really good for AD units because AD units typically are just trying to auto attack a bunch. So Gwinsu, what you would use the Rod and you'd use the Bow. It also kills the Rod because if you're playing around AD, a Rod is typically an AP item. It makes a lot of AP items. So one of the better items you can make for an AD unit is that you can make a Gwinsu, which just gives them a bunch of attack speed and allows them to auto attack a bunch. So that works out really, really well. If you're playing around AP, you might want to make Spark or red buff, or even maybe potentially red buff, because Spark gives you that utility of shredding the opponent so that they take more magic damage, right? It reduces their magic resist. Red buff is also a utility item that gives you the ability to do anti-heal. Now, of course, you don't have to necessarily slam these items. You could greed your items a little bit, but if you're playing tempo, if you're trying to win streak, a lot of times you can just make 2 complete items, right? You can make Spark red buff, because that just gives you all your utility and it'll make you very, very strong in your early game at the consequence of maybe not getting another bow drop and maybe not getting another Rod or cloak drop. So it's a little bit more risky if you're slamming these items early. Or if you're playing around AD, you can make a Gwinsu and a Runans, because Gwinsu Runans is a really good pairing because Runans, every time you attack, it fires a bolt to another unit. So if you ramp up a bunch of attack speed, your unit now has like an AoE effect where they're hitting multiple units. So you can make that item pairing. Even though Runans isn't the strongest item for a lot of units, it helps you to streak, and that's a lot of value that you get. So you can just slam all your items in that way using the same type of opener depending on what you have, obviously. Now, this is going to start to tie back into that question, because I think you guys that are using your noggins are going to see that I have a tier and a cloak and I have a bow and a bow. So what do you think that we should make here? Depending on your spot, right? If you're playing AD or if you're playing snipers, a lot of times adaptive helm is really good here. Because the problem with adaptive helm, which we'll talk about in a second, is that it kills really valuable components. If you're playing around snipers, you don't really need a tier, because a lot of the snipers don't really want a mana generation item. Like Caitlyn really wants one, but pretty much everybody else doesn't really care that much about making a Shojin or making a blue buff. So usually when you see an AD line, you're thinking to yourself, I can use this tier to become a frontline item. Additionally, Cloak, it doesn't have that much value. You could make an even Shroud, but it's not that important. So because there's other options for you. So making adaptive helm is very, very good, because you're basically taking 2 components that you don't really care too much for and turning them straight into a frontline item that you can use on the team. Excuse me. Additionally, let's say you're playing AP. If you're playing AP, sometimes you can make adaptive helm, sometimes you can make red buff, sometimes you can also make shiv if you don't think that the tier is super valuable for your particular build that you're doing. It depends on the unit, which we'll talk about probably tomorrow a little bit. But the thing about making adaptive helm with AP items is that, I think I have it here, if you look at the shred components, right? Look at the ways, if you're playing AP, you're going to want to make shred eventually in the game. It just boosts your damage by a lot. Trust me, what it does is shred reduces the magic resist by 30%. So it effectively increases your DPS by like, I forget the exact number, but like somewhere between like 20-ish% or something. Because like armor and calculations are weird, but whatever. The idea is that you always want to prioritize making shred if you're playing an AP comp. It just boosts your damage. Plain and simple. So you can either make the frontline shred option, which is Spark, or the backline shred option, which is Shiv. Now, if you're making adaptive helm, you're using a cloak and you're using a tier, which means that you are now less likely to be able to make a Spark, which uses one of the cloaks, and you're less likely to make a Shiv, which uses one of the tiers. So you're basically putting yourself in a situation where you might not be able to make shred later in the game, just statistically. Now, this doesn't always happen, but I'm talking about like early game slams versus late game slams. Adaptive helm, if you already have shred and sunder and anti-heal, and you have all of these things already done on your board, you're probably going to be fine to slam adaptive helm because you can just get uses out of the components. But you have to be very careful. Additionally, like if you're playing around tempo, you might want to make something like adaptive red buff because it gives you a lot of flexibility, right? Red buff is basically just attack speed. Even backline casting units really like attack speed a lot of time. Backline AD units really like attack speed. So red buff is okay to slam if you're trying to play tempo. You won't get yourself into a really bad spot. And adaptive helm could be used both as a frontline and a backline item. So at the cost of potentially having anti-heal and shred and sundering later, you're using these components in order to put yourself in a spot where you're very strong in your early game and they're not items that are necessarily super bad in your late game. So we end this video coming back to the original question: should I make a adaptive helm? And for me, I always say this to beginners. I always say it really depends on your spot, as we kind of talked about throughout this whole video, but I always say often no, right? And it always comes back to the fact that adaptive helm makes it so it's very hard, sometimes difficult for you to make shred and sundering later if you're playing around AP. It is a very strong item, it is a very good item, but every item, you can do the same argument for almost every item in the game. But a lot of times you have to consider, what am I using these components for, and if this is a good idea. So anyways, thank you for watching my video. Hopefully it was somewhat informative. And we're going to do a part 2 tomorrow about diminishing returns, ideally if I finish it in time, and then maybe a part 3 that's going to be about some other stuff that I have planned. So we'll see how it goes. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and have a great rest of the day. Bye bye.